So I want to thank you for having me, Mike, and then for everybody for joining. I enjoyed the last time I was here talking about the Black Badge of Courage, um, and I'm excited now to share with you all my most recent publication, my book, Freedom Soldiers. I got a copy here. It's out with Oxford University Press. Um, and they sometimes run special deals if you want to purchase it on Oxford University Press. They have discount codes at different times of the year. And I'm a professor of history at Purdue University here in Indiana. And I don't know, I heard somebody in their chat earlier discussing the storms that have been rolling through. And currently, the winds are not blowing. But I had to email Mike at about 6:20 Eastern time to mention that my power was flickering. So if I disappear, I will try to scurry back online as quickly as I can and pick up. Hopefully, the power will come back on if it does indeed go off. Just a little heads up. And then another one is that I have two little babies going to bed upstairs. My wife is handling them. So if there's screaming and shouting, please don't be afraid. So I thought I would begin Freedom Soldiers with a story about where my interest came from, um, all the way back when I began to research this book about 10 years ago. Uh, and it began with a courts-martial case from the American Civil War that I found in an edited volume, the Freedom Documentary Collection, which is housed at the University of Maryland, put together a collection of primary sources on Black soldiers, the Black military experience. And paging through it, I found the story of John Mitchell. And John Mitchell was enslaved before the war. He was from Mississippi, just near the southern portion of Mississippi. I believe it was Washington, Mississippi. And when the war broke out, Grant made his way down the river. uh, John Mitchell had an opportunity to free himself. So he fled his enslavers. He made his way all the way to Vicksburg. And then once he made it to Vicksburg, he had the opportunity of enlisting in the United States Colored Troops, or USCT. At that point, it was the 3rd Mississippi Infantry African Descent, but it later became the 53rd United States Colored Infantry. And he enlisted, like many. He was probably very excited for the opportunity to be free by putting on Union Blue. The Emancipation Proclamation provided that opportunity. He was probably also very excited to perhaps get back at his enslavers who had punished him for years, most likely in the cotton fields. His compiled military service record just listed, I think, field hand. So it might have been any number of crops, but it being so prevalent there, perhaps he was picking cotton, and he probably relished the opportunity to be able to fight his enslavers, to help suppress the Confederate rebellion. But his time in the United States Colored Infantry and the U.S. Army was not all that he had hoped it would be. He found early that his captain for his unit, was kicking and cuffing him, as he later said. He was beating him. Um, this might have been mere training of the soldier. The discipline, of course, as many of you probably know, was very harsh. It could have also been a cruel officer, a particularly cruel officer, as the USCT had both very harsh disciplinarians who were just following the way that they had been trained, and there were also cruel officers. And so he asked to be transferred to a different company, but he was not provided that opportunity. And so finally, just under a month after entering the United States Colored Infantry, he decamped. Um, and he wasn't a shirker. He wasn't seeking to get out of the army or to get out of work. In fact, when he was caught by the provost marshals, he was working on a steamboat on the Mississippi River. He was arrested. He was imprisoned, most likely at the Vicksburg Guardhouse, which you see in the image there from the Library of Congress. You also see two black soldiers sitting on the wooden horse, being punished, and then a guard watching them. So this was most likely where John Mitchell was kept before he was brought before the courts martial. He was tried, and he was sentenced by the courts martial judges to work at hard labor with a ball and chain. So just less than a year after he had escaped slavery, he finds himself working without pay at hard labor under grueling conditions. So he might have been quite chagrined at that point, but it gets darker from there. The courts-martial case was reviewed. The brigadier general, I believe it was a brigadier general, said that the desertions have become too common, and he rejected the sentence, sent it back to the courts-martial, and had them review what they had decided. Uh, and so the courts-martial judges, taking a cue from their commander, gave John Mitchell the harshest of the penalties for desertion, which was execution by firing squad. And on September 15th, John Mitchell became the first and only black soldier executed for desertion, at least after a courts-martial trial during the Civil War. And John Mitchell's story was a curious one for me because, as I'm sure many of you know, the story that we typically understand about black military service during the American Civil War is one that informed and now often informs us in the film Glory. It's an epic story of freedom, formerly enslaved men fighting against their enslavers, going to great difficulty to become disciplined soldiers, attacking Battery Wagner under very compassionate leaders like Robert Gould Shaw. Uh, and we know about this Black warrior's bravery. Historians have collected it. I mentioned kind of its origins in the last time I was speaking with you all, the Black Badge of Courage. This became a badge of honor for African Americans because they indeed fight bravely. They fought bravely, and it helped them attain many things, including citizenship, including the right to vote. And most of these soldiers did heroic things on the battlefield or in camps, helping to suppress the rebellion. But my research and my findings with John Mitchell showed that not all freedom fighters were fighting against the Confederacy. That there were also men who were fighting to get away from the type of treatment that they had experienced in slavery, or do various other things like take care of their families. And I found other historians have documented some of these desertion cases in their collections on different regiments. And the original or the official record includes just over 12,000 USCT deserters. And so I went to the National Archives to see if there were more cases like John Mitchell's, and to see what reasons black soldiers gave as to why they would desert something. Desert an army that was fighting for their freedom, that had provided their freedom upon enlistment, and was trying to suppress a Confederacy bent on creating a pro-slavery republic. And what I found was it wasn't the result of waning patriotism. These weren't men who had left the United States colored troops because they no longer believed in the mission of the U.S. Army or the United States. Instead, what I found was that they were fighting for freedom off the battlefield. They were fighting in camps, courts, and prisons. They were fighting at various times and in various places against um, the all the difficulties that they faced. And so what I'll do today is I'll this evening is I'll provide some of these stories and provide the narrative that I detail in greater with greater detail in my book, Freedom Soldiers. And what these stories all show is that as soon as black soldiers put on their Union uniforms, it did not mean that they were free immediately. They were legally free, but emancipation was a process, something that they had to figure out. Freedom was something that they all coveted, but they had to figure out what exactly freedom would look like as they encountered enslavers on the battlefield, as they encountered officers who were disciplining them, not unlike the disciplinarians on cotton fields and in sugarcane fields. So I will begin by providing an overview. It will probably be a review for many of you, but I figure it'll get us all on the same page. I'll detail why the black soldiers were enlisted and why they decided to join. Then I'll discuss military discipline and how it came to shape the soldiers' experiences. And then I'll conclude by talking about the resistance and how they continued fighting for freedom in camps, courts, and prisons. So, of course, the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865, fought to suppress the Confederate rebellion. Destruction of slavery was not Lincoln's goal at the beginning, of course. And African Americans clamored, especially in the North, where they had greater opportunities, to join this cause, to fight for the Union, in hopes that perhaps it might mean the end of slavery. They tried to sign up. Frederick Douglass delivered speeches, wrote editorials in his newspaper, Douglass Monthly, trying to get black men into the United States Army. But they were not permitted in 1861 to join the Army. The Militia Act of 1792 said that only able-bodied white men could join the ranks. And in addition to that, the United States, both North and South, there was a deep fear of servile insurrection. A lot of this was informed by histories of the Haitian Revolution that said that African American or people of African descent, once given guns, would be fighting viciously and wouldn't be able to stop, informed by these racist ideas at the time. And at the same time, there was also oddly enough, a racist idea that black men were cowards, and as soon as you gave them a gun, and they faced their former enslaver upon the battlefield, that they would drop the gun and run from the field of battle. So for these reasons, tradition, racial beliefs, and prejudices, they were kept out of the Union Army. But of course, Abraham Lincoln was not able to fight merely for the Union. The flight of enslaved Southerners demonstrated to him and many across the North that they were trying to free themselves. You see here Fortress Monroe. That is where Butler delivered that decree, the contraband of war that gave the United States, the government, the opportunity to free enslaved people without coming out against slavery directly, which saved Lincoln from having to claw back Kentucky and Maryland and the other border states, which might have left if he declared emancipation early on. But these enslaved Southerners demonstrated to Lincoln and to others that emancipation could become a strategy to wield against the Confederacy. That a Confederacy that had enslaved men and women cultivating crops, nurturing children, or even bringing them into the army, giving them rebel uniforms, and having them not fight, but to cook meals for, or brush horses for, or cultivate fires for the Confederate soldiers. So Lincoln decided ultimately that he would use emancipation as a tool of war to help destroy the Confederacy. And of course, on January 1st, 1863, he delivered his Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the enslaved men and women who were in states still under rebellion. And profoundly, Lincoln decided also at that moment to permit black men to enlist in the Union Army. And if you're interested, I recently published an article in the Abraham Lincoln Association talking about that decision that Lincoln came to. And in short order, what I argue is that he came to meet and read histories of black soldiers in the period between the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation and the final Emancipation Proclamation, and was convinced that they would be brave soldiers who would indeed fight for their own freedom, and if the Union protected that freedom, the Union. And so Lincoln decided to involve these African Americans into the fight. He established the Bureau of Colored Troops, or Stanton did, his war secretary, on May 22nd, 1863. It established the United States Colored Troops, the segregated unit of the U.S. Army, or USCT. And the priorities were to enlist black soldiers, get as many men in uniform as possible, and because of racial prejudices at the time, fears and concerns that black men could not lead themselves, there was an emphasis on enlisting white officers. Now, just because African Americans were permitted to serve didn't mean all of them wanted to serve or immediately wanted to serve. Eventually, 500,000 black Northerners wanted to join, but African Americans also debated whether or not they should join. They were Some of them were against service. They thought that the lower pay, as they soon found out they would receive, or the lack of bounties or lower bounties, showed that they would experience discrimination even as they put their lives on the line. They also talked about previous treatment, the fact that black soldiers had fought in the American Revolution. Instead of slavery going away after the American Revolution, of course, it expanded and became further entrenched. But recruiters like Frederick Douglass persuaded many African Americans in the North to join. He said that, as you see here in the quotation, to fight for the government in this tremendous war is to fight for nationality and for a place with all other classes of our fellow citizens. And so he pressed for black Northerners to join. even if they were paid less, even if they had to serve under white officers. They also wanted to serve because by fighting, they could reaffirm their power to free themselves and push back against derisive, cowardice claims by asserting their manhood. And here you see two flags that were created for the USCT regiments. One says, "Let us prove ourselves men," and the other says, "Rather die free men than live to be slaves." But the reasons for enlistment by Black Northerners was not the same as it was for Black Southerners. And in my findings, I go back through and I really try to analyze why Black Southerners, the men who had been or who had been enslaved when the war began by and large, why they enlisted. Because 130,000 of the 180,000 who served were from the South. Uh, and of course, as historians have found and discovered and discussed, they enlisted to emancipate themselves from slavery. Slavery offered them the opportunity, or service offered them the opportunity to escape um, slavery. But of course, freedom has many different meanings, and different people seek different reasons and different freedoms. So I broke them down here. Reasons for enlistment: legal freedom. They would receive their emancipation upon enlistment. Some of them left because they wanted to leave behind the jobs that they had conducted on plantations. You see an image that was sketched during the war. I find it really compelling because you have black soldier, or excuse me, I'm not sure if they're soldiers, but field hands leaving the field and leaving behind the plow. So a lot of these soldiers discussed how they'd much rather serve in the Union Army or fight their enemies rather than continue to labor under harsh rules from enslavers. Some of them left to free their families, and here you see the famous Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, um, who talked about their motivations in his his wartime journal. He said that they have peculiarities of motive which belong to them alone, and instead of leaving their homes and families to fight, like Northerners, they are fighting for their homes and their families, and they show resolution and sagacity, which a personal purpose gives. So this invigoration of these men, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, an abolitionist who had supported John Brown and came to lead a black regiment during the war, identified and the soldiers themselves described why they decided to leave, as in the case of William and Marilda Jones, who were both from Kentucky. William and Marilda had saved up about $200, $300, left their plantation when their enslaver went off on some duty. He had said that if you leave, I will kill you, but they left anyways. And on their way, they finally made it to Union lines. And once asked why he enlisted, Williams said, "I enlisted to free my wife and serve the government during the balance of my days." And just show the sagacity with which personal purpose gives. I think Williams' case is particularly important because he was in his 60s or his 70s, according to his compiled military service record. So he chose, even at that age in the 19th century, to join up and to fight in order to help free his wife. And then you have the case of the Smith family, whose picture has now become quite popular. You see the Smith family here in the corner, Mary, Samuel, Molly, and Maggie. And I find this picture very compelling because he put on his Union blue and he's there with his family, taking the moment to show his patriotism, but also to be with his family. Others joined in order to seek literacy skills, and others had religious motivations, them thinking that this was the Jubilee that had been foreordained. They compared Lincoln to Moses, and this was their way of contributing to that. So, for this reason, many black Southerners had joined. But of course, once they entered the army, black Northerners and black Southerners experienced the discipline of the 19th century army. One of the hardest, if not the second most challenging of professions during the 19th century, of course, only second to slavery. Uh, and discipline was harsh, as many of you probably know, because they had to prepare civilians, citizen soldiers, for combat and make sure that they were willing to put everything on the line in order to save their nation. And in the Army, discipline was defined as being one measurement of combat efficiency, which is to say willingness to enter battle and to kill, or two, willingness to obey orders, to subordinate oneself to the Army, not to question an officer or not to hit an officer. Ambrose Bierce writes great. Civil War stories about two buddies who had grown up with one another, but one of them was an officer, and the soldier hits the officer, and of course now the soldier needs to be disciplined, and ultimately, well, I won't give away the end, but it shows that relationships changed once you entered the Union Army because they needed to subordinate themselves. And in the USCT, there was an additional reason for discipline, and that was to control emancipation. Because this process of emancipation, this fear that African Americans, if given guns, would attack Confederates and not stop when the white flag had been raised, or not stop at simply killing soldiers on battlefields, but might also turn their guns on civilians, on women and children. These are the fears that had been voiced in Congress. Uh, and white Northerners also thought that many African Americans were not prepared for freedom. Even abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison had used racial theories and ideas to suggest that freedom needed to be an extended process, almost an apprenticeship, so that African Americans would learn what freedom was like before they were given full opportunities to follow their freedom. So within the USCT, with these white officers being selected, people like Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Robert Gould Shaw needed to control emancipation, make sure that soldiers not only knew when to fight, but when to stop fighting. That they knew the difference between what free labor was and what slave labor was. That they weren't being compelled to do labor, but they needed to appreciate that by hard work they could accomplish things. And in the army, there were, of course, factors disrupting discipline. Traditions from home, for instance, as I just mentioned in the Ambrose Bierce case, this sense of equality that existed among soldiers, especially the citizen soldier ideal. This idea that soldiers did not want to become the professional soldiers of European armies. They wanted to retain their citizenship, their independence. Uh, and for black men, they had the additional factor disrupting discipline is that they were becoming free. They needed to help take care of their families. They needed to help take care of their own bodies. Some of them wanted to escape the violence that they had seen on plantations or in slavery. So they were trying to do their best to become free men within the army. But because of this discipline, this harsh discipline, it did not mesh well. And as a result, there was also forms of punishment used both against white soldiers and black soldiers. And of course, corporal punishment was the means of use. I have here an image of shaming that comes from a black soldier who's wearing a placard that reads thief. And of course, he would have been marched out of camp. Deserter or cowards had the same things applied to them. And then I have two images on the side. You have carrying a log. This comes from John Billings, Hardtack and Coffee, where he describes the corporal punishment that existed, and then another soldier being bucked and gagged so that he couldn't move. And these practices were used on black men as well as white men. But of course, for formerly enslaved men, people like John Mitchell, these smacked of slavery. These are the same kinds of punishments that they had just left slavery to escape from. And so as a result, there was this friction that existed within the United States colored troops. And just to give you a snapshot before I move into the ways in which black soldiers resisted against these forms of oppression that continued as they fought for freedom while they were in Union Blue. Of course, black soldiers had major accomplishments. In the first year alone, they made names for themselves at Port Hudson, Milliken's Bend, and at Fort or Battery Wagner as they confronted Confederates, or in Milliken's Bend case, defended against a fearsome foe. And they were able to achieve great things as a result of the courage that most black soldiers were able to do. They redeemed their manhood. They made sacrifices as citizens that helped persuade people, including Abraham Lincoln, that black people should be provided the vote. They were able to establish their freedom, and they were able to attain self-respect. And here I have Thomas Long, who was a chaplain in the 1st South Carolina. That's Thomas Wentworth Higginson's regiment. And Thomas Wentworth Higginson recorded a prayer that Thomas Long, a formerly enslaved Floridian, had delivered to his troops. And he said, this is Thomas Long in his prayer. He says, "We have showed our energy and our courage and our naturally manhood. Another thing is, suppose you had kept your freedom without enlisting in this army. Your children might have grown up free, but would have always been always flung in their faces. Your father never fought for his own freedom, and what could they answer? So here you see all of those things, a redemption of manhood, an establishment of freedom, an attainment of self-respect, all things that contributed to ultimately black men being permitted to become citizens as a result of the 14th Amendment and then fulfilling that in the 15th Amendment. So they accomplished great things, but of course there were these other 12,000 soldiers who deserted. And so the question becomes, why? Why did they desert? If they could achieve all of these things, what made it so necessary that they needed to desert? Um, well, this leads to resistance, resistance in the ranks. And it shows that service was not liberating for all. There were obstacles to attaining freedom. The reason that they had enlisted in the army. For some of them, it was harsh discipline. Some of them, it was wartime circumstances. They had families that needed their help. They were receiving letters from their families. They needed to help them. Sometimes it was battlefield outcomes that led them to become wounded, and as a result, need to return home to the care of families, because, of course, that's the way that most 19th century Americans, whether white or black, experienced healthcare. Healthcare was done at home, and for formerly enslaved men, it was done especially by formerly enslaved women, either mothers or wives or some woman in their community. So the soldiers reacted to these obstacles that they encountered using resistance tools that they had employed during slavery. And I concentrate in my project primarily on, or entirely on, the formerly enslaved soldiers. Uh, so you have mutiny, which is, of course, massed organized revolts against power. You had mutinies that existed in the South against officers. The Fort Jackson one was most famous. That's where a cruel enslaver had been beating and then used a whip on formerly enslaved men in Louisiana, and they staged a mutiny. But the most common one, and the one that I focus on in Freedom Soldiers, was flight, a tool that had been used by enslaved men and women. And over 12,000 deserted or were tried for their desertion. We don't know the actual numbers because if they just left and came back, it wouldn't have been recorded. And they defended their actions in the courts martial. And that's where my book really takes hold of these questions to try to understand what this resistance means and what it can tell us about the American Civil War. So flight, of course, was a means of resistance during bondage. It was a way of, for those who took the Underground Railroad, of establishing freedom permanently. Frederick Douglass was able to escape slavery by getting a pass and that his wife had secured for him and making his way to New York and then later to New Bedford before he settled down in Rochester. So for some of these enslaved men and women, running away was a great way to establish a freedom, but for others, and more often, it was a flight was a way of enjoying freedoms while still within bondage. Many enslaved men and women would take breaks. Sometimes they would have a hot-headed overseer. They knew if he got drunk or if they sassed him, that he might kill them. So they would run away. They would go hang out in the bayous until their master would cool off, and then they would come back. Frederick Douglass describes doing this. Octave Johnson is another one that he describes doing this. Uh, so they would take these temporary breaks, these moments to free themselves from slavery while not being able to escape slavery entirely, or because perhaps they didn't want to escape slavery entirely because they had family and friends that kept them there. Right. So they would have loved to have escaped as an entire family unit, but of course, as the parents will know, trying to get a 2-year-old to do much anything, especially with people chasing you, would be a quite difficult task. And these forms of resistance continued within the United States colored troops. And of course, it was called desertion, right? The crime of leaving the army either without permission for extended breaks. It was also called AWOL, absence without leave. And in my project, I call them leaves of freedom to kind of break away from the military jargon so that I can better understand it within the context of the soldiers themselves, how they understood it. So the reasons why they would take these leaves of freedom, which were usually temporary breaks, was to escape violence from abusive officers. People like John Mitchell might leave entirely from the army. They just would escape. They would go find jobs. Some of them would actually escape and go enlist in other regiments. A lot of soldiers also took leaves of freedom to secure their families, to ensure that the very thing that many of them had left slavery to accomplish, which is to secure the safety of their wives and their children, they still had that motivation even after they enlisted. So they would leave to help their families. And the reason that they would help their families probably won't surprise you. Some of them had to leave their families in slavery in order to enlist. So they found out that their enslavers were abusing them. Spotswood Rice, he did not desert, but he gives us a insight into the thinking of the soldiers. And he shows us, he writes this letter to the enslavers of his children. He says, I want you to understand that Mary is my child and she is a God given right of my own. And to remember that the longer you keep my child from me, the longer you will have to burn in hell and the quicker you'll get there. So a lot of these soldiers kept tabs on what their families were doing. And in a similar region, you had the First and Second Kansas make a raid into Missouri to uh, get their families out of bondage. So you have them leaving, taking breaks that aren't recorded. You also have families that left because their families were destitute or ill. Hardkin Perkins of the 3rd United States Colored Heavy Artillery was in Memphis. He enlisted there in Memphis, and his family lived not far. His mother lived not far in the refugee camp that had been established there. And so when he was put on trial for courts martial, he said plainly why he left. He said, I was paid off. He got his money and he went to carry it out to his mother, who probably needed funds in order to buy food or pay for shelter, especially as many of these women had left slavery and not being able to find work for the army. They needed money that was provided by their husbands. Others left to maintain their health. They might find their care at home. Formerly enslaved men, especially, would return home. People like Richard Wright's ancestors, the novelist, he had great one grandfather who served in the United States Colored Troops, and he speaks about this in the autobiographical-esque novel Black Boy, but he also had another grandfather, his other grandfather, who, with his two brothers, had enlisted in Mississippi and then returned home because they had suffered from their regiment was suffering from, I believe it was typhoid. There was an outbreak of some disease in their regiment, so they went home to escape the illness or to recuperate from help. And they would there, while at home, receive the assistance often of formerly enslaved women, or in some cases enslaved women, uh, and get the aid that they required. Now, of course, the army was not pleased when these soldiers did this. The point of the discipline was, of course, to keep these soldiers in camp. That's why you had pickets. They weren't only watching for Confederates on the line; they were also watching to ensure that the soldiers didn't go off to get whiskey or do whatever a bored soldier might do, play cards, gamble, go see their families. So of course the Union Army had to have a way of policing these soldiers, white or black. Uh, and they needed to uphold just discipline. The courts martial, the system of looking after these soldiers, was not about justice. If justice was served, fine. But as you see here from William Tecumseh Sherman after the war, he says the object of military law is to govern armies composed of strong men so as to be capable of exercising the largest measure of force. And in that description, he goes on to describe the difference between civilian courts and military courts, concentrating on the fact that they must please Mars. It's the god of war that they must please, not the god of justice. Uh, but for black soldiers who experienced the courts martial, a lot of historians have discussed how they had great opportunities, unprecedented opportunities to appeal to a higher justice rather than simply deal with enslavers. And I completely agree that in many cases, most cases, black soldiers got new opportunities. But there were also troubles within the courts martial. And part of it stems from the fact that all the judges were white. All the judges on the courts martial were white because only officers could serve on the courts martial. And since very few black soldiers ever became officers, all the officers sitting on a courts martial, and here I give you an image to kind of understand the courts martial, what it would look like. it became a means of um, supplying discipline, but these white officers also lacked, in many cases, an understanding, a fulsome understanding, appreciation for what these formerly enslaved men's families were going through. And it made it quite difficult for them to understand when soldiers said what they said, described their discipline. And of course, these judges were skilled at dealing with desertion because they had to be. Desertion was a major problem, if not the most major disciplinary problem that the courts martials looked at. 27,000, nearly 28,000 trials for desertion. And these officers were tough on deserters, convicting 87%. At the beginning of the war, they would have executed many of these soldiers, but increasingly, especially as Lincoln started to read these cases, and talk about the legs cases, soldiers that weren't able to withstand. The execution fell, so increasingly they would discipline them by giving them hard labor, things that happened to John Mitchell. 653 black soldiers were tried, and they were convicted at a higher rate, 69% by the number of deserters that I was able to find in the courts martial records housed at the National Archives. And when they tried these cases, they weren't trying them in a way that you might assume. They weren't trying to say these soldiers lacked patriotism, that they were soldiers that were cowards. They weren't taught using this language. They were actually using the language of contracts and saying that the soldiers had signed enlistment contracts and that the soldiers had violated these contracts by leaving the U.S. Army. So this meant that when black soldiers stood before a courts martial and described why they left, they were given an opportunity to speak of their cases. They often had to respond to this courts martial jurisprudence that didn't much care for the reasons why they left. So they developed legal tools in order to continue fighting for freedom within the courts martial when they were tried for desertion. They pointed to the ignorance of the law, saying that as slavery had left them in a stupor, ignorant of the law. You see here from William Owens, he said, I didn't know anything. I didn't know one letter from another when he was describing why he left. Others would say, that they didn't hear the rules being read to them. They didn't understand that desertion was a crime. Others would try to persuade courts martial judges that they left because their families. So they appealed to the hearts of these officers. But also, while they were describing their families, they were talking about a relationship that they had just facilitated. So regardless if they were convicted or not, they were able to describe and have transcribed their relationship with their family, something that was meaningful to them. Therefore, they were fighting for their freedom by using their words to talk about the relationships that they had built. And once the war carried on, many of them started to appreciate contracts, and they would dispute contract validity. In some cases, they would say, that officers abused them, and that when they had signed the enlistment contracts, they had no anticipation of being abused by officers. Others would say that they had enlisted in one regiment but were placed in another. Others would argue that they had been kept longer than their enlistment contracts had permitted, therefore they were allowed to leave. And so in these ways, they were able to push back against the harsh discipline that was used within the courts martial in order to maintain their freedom. And finally, they would fight back from prisons. Many of these soldiers who were convicted in the courts martial would be sent to military prisons. Early on, as I mentioned, they would execute them. It was very ritualistic execution. You see here an image from Harper's Weekly. It would be by a firing squad. They would be placed on coffins. Graves would be put behind them, and a big U of all their comrades would be established around them while they would sit at the top. They would be read their charges blindfolded, and then, as one soldier said, be sent into eternity. But that was rarely used later in the war. Increasingly, the Union Army understood it needed soldiers, and a deserter is necessary regardless. Lincoln also, as I mentioned, wanted to be less harsh on the soldiers. So increasingly, it moved to imprisonment as a means of disciplining soldiers. Fort Leavenworth prison, where many soldiers were sent later on in the 19th century and the 20th century, wasn't established. Instead, as you saw with John Mitchell, they often were imprisoned near their regiments. They were put in guard houses. Sometimes they were placed in forts, as in many deserters were sent to the Dry Tortugas in Florida. And then finally, some of them were just sent to city jails. New Orleans, Charleston. Once the Union was able to conquer these places, they placed the deserters in these spots, basically anywhere they could find space and keep these soldiers in place. But once in prison, these soldiers did not find themselves ashamed. They did not think what they did was wrong. In fact, they wrote letters trying to seek mercy, or more specifically, to dispute the injustice that they suffered and therefore seek release by fighting for their freedom with words. So these formerly enslaved soldiers would use what I call the good soldier argument. They said that they were good soldiers, that they you see here from Washington. This arrow should be pointing from Washington. He says, I am a good soldier, always has done what is right, but my captain drew a pistol on me, suggesting that he had been compelled to act. So he says, I dropped these few lines asking for justice. So here you see him confront that contractual jurisprudence, saying that an officer made me do it because he violated the contract that I had signed by threatening to use force against me. And so now he's seeking justice, writing to a letter. Others would challenge the jurisprudence. You have another good soldier argument and challenging of jurisprudence by John Handy. He says, Sir, I am a poor colored man. I have been a slave all my life. I never had the rules or regulations read to me, and therefore knew nothing about the army. I hope that you will be so kind as to forgive me this time and let me go to my regiment. I promise you that I will be a good soldier, and I know better next time. This is all at present, hoping that you will look into my case. So you see here another soldier talking about how he can be a good soldier or how he was a good soldier, but as a result of some hiccup in the chain of command, he didn't get read the rules. Therefore, he should be permitted to leave. Others, a major tool that they would use when trying to appeal to officers, to commanders, and even to Lincoln, they would say that they needed their family. And here again, they're most likely appealing to the hearts of officers who were probably missing their families as well. In Lincoln's case, of course, having lost Willie in the White House, he would have been particularly prone to listen to these arguments. Um, But in addition to that, what they're signaling in these letters is they're talking about the suffering of the innocent. That by keeping them in prison and unable to earn a wage, they are causing innocent family members, wives and children who did nothing wrong, to suffer as a result of the incarceration. And through this, they are arguing that incarceration itself was an illegitimate punishment for the crime, that by punishing them, they are making their families suffer. So through this, they were able to further fight for their family, which for many of these men was freedom itself. And as a result, this is, in conclusion, what I learned from these formerly enslaved men. That emancipation was not instantaneous. That many of them left slavery, put on Union Blue, and signed the enlistment contracts, establishing their legal freedom. But legal freedom is not freedom itself. For many of them, it was a journey out of slavery, and it was shaped by various circumstances. And that emancipation as an ongoing process, something that they were learning and responding to obstacles that they encountered, was something that existed in the army as much as it existed in refugee camps or in cities where they were able to escape to. And in the USCT, these obstacles included discipline and the fact that duties limit them their ability to help their families, to do what they very much wanted to do. And as a result, they continued their journey in the army by fighting for their freedom. These are freedom soldiers. These formerly enslaved men took leaves of freedom, took breaks from the army. They defended their leaves of freedom in the courts martial, and then they demanded officials accept their departures as legitimate means of taking the freedom which they enlisted for from prisons. And that's what I discussed. And I think this image, which graces the cover of my book, is a great way to show how important family lives remain to the soldiers. These are soldiers being mustered out in Arkansas at the end of the war. And here you see families, a baby, a soldier being held. You see this one of my favorites. It reminds me of my son looking up at his dad, very excited to have his dad home. So I'm excited to hear questions that you might have about freedom soldiers, and I'll take down my my PowerPoint so I can see you.